Hi everyone, my name is Tiffany. In this video, I'm going to be sharing what it's like being an English and Japanese bilingual, and I want to share my story by doing so. By title, I realize this sounds like a pretty basic topic, but to me, there's a lot to uncover, because I think there is something unique if you're bilingual, particularly in English and in Japanese. So if you are watching this and you speak more than 2 languages, including Japanese, do share with me in the comment section what other languages you speak and whether or not my experience applies to you too as a multilingual. So to share my experience, my first language I would say is Japanese from being born and raised here and attending a local school until age 12. But my parents are both American and they were operating their private English school that they owned in Ibaraki Prefecture. We lived in an area where we were the only foreigners living there, and I felt that I was living in 2 different worlds in one place. Inside the house, my dad wanted my brother and I to use English since that was our only chance to practice the language. And outside the house, including school and being with friends, was all in Japanese. Because both my mom and my dad were dealing with a lot of students, from young kids to adults, class after class, and from one city to another for 5 or 6 days a week, I remember being with my friends or neighbors longer than with my parents. And that's no fault to my parents at all because they have always been very loving and caring and present. So I never felt neglected just because of their busy schedule. But even without being with my parents, Japan has a lot of community-based activities, like all the time. So you're always with someone or in a group doing something. Through the school, there were, of course, official school trips and camping events with the basketball team I was in, and community activities with the neighbors and such. But also there were other activities where we'd get together that was a non-official event. For example, in the summertime, outside of school hours at night, we would gather at the school campus to create our own fireworks event, of course with adult supervision. And in the wintertime, when it snowed, we would play snowball fight in the neighborhood or at the school campus over the weekend. And I also remember celebrating New Year's at a family gathering at a friend's house. And with one of our closest family friends, they would invite my brother and I on their family road trips every year. And so much more, but I share all that to say I was in a Japanese environment for the most part. And now looking back, I believe this environment did something to my language ability because at the time, I don't think I was horrible at English, but English did feel like a script for me, based on what we learned in school or, my own parents being English teachers, instead of English feeling like a language I can express myself freely. In kindergarten, my mom was my English teacher, and in elementary school, my dad was my English teacher. And learning a language academically really is different from learning it as a native, because if you think about it, learning it natively is stored in a different part of your brain than learning it academically. And sometimes the fault of learning it academically is that it's difficult to obtain the skills you need to think or have a thought process in that language, because sometimes academics are built so that subconsciously you're still depending on your native language so that you can comprehend to then learn another language. So at the time, I'm sure I could speak English, but I wasn't thinking in English. So my English was a direct translation from Japanese in my mind and then using English words to speak. And this made a huge effect and overwhelming experience when moving to America because it made me feel that I couldn't speak English. And I've shared in some previous YouTube interviews that I couldn't speak English when I first moved to America. But now that I really think about it, it's not that I couldn't speak English, but rather I didn't have the skills to fully have a thought process in English because I had never done that living in Japan. And one prime example my dad has shared in a YouTube interview is that one day I came home from one of my first days of attending American school and I was doing my math homework, but it was a sentence problem. And I actually remember this where I was crying doing the homework because I was frustrated that I was able to pronounce every word in that sentence problem, but I didn't have a single brain cell for English reading comprehension, that I didn't know how to solve the problem. I didn't understand what I was trying to say. And the way my dad described it is that I was trying to translate the question into Japanese in my head and trying to solve the problem back in English. And although that's just one example, I remember that process continued in other scenarios in my first few years of living in America. And it got to the point where there was only so much I could understand by translating in my head that I realized it's easier to learn and understand directly from English to English. And once I started working on that skill for a few years, I was able to just understand the context directly in English. And from doing that for so long in various situations, it got to the point where I don't know how to say that in Japanese because I'm not thinking in Japanese and it's a completely different world I'm dealing with. And to this point, I want to share something I recently shared in another YouTube interview I did. And one of the questions was, what do you think the biggest difference is between Japan and America? And among so many differences there are between the two, the answer I gave was behavior. I think people in America can be too self-centered, where it's all about what I say and how I feel, and everyone is like that towards each other. So if I were to be extreme about it, it's almost like everyone is talking and no one is listening because, again, everybody is self-centered. But to be self-centered, I don't think is necessarily a bad thing entirely, because there are certain cases where you should put yourself first, but there is certainly a time and place for it. And oppositely, I think Japanese people don't put themselves first enough, where they prioritize others before their own. So for an extreme on this, I think this sometimes results in not having their own opinions because their decision is made based on others. Which again, I don't think it's entirely bad because the world doesn't revolve around you. But this too certainly has a time and place for it. And this applies to my experience where, without even trying, I have two different behaviors by speaking two languages. And some people may take this as, one may be more true to myself than the other, or I must be faking another personality, which is not at all the case, and I will elaborate on this. But this reminds me that it makes sense as to why I've gotten comments from English speakers saying she sounds so native in English, or I can't even tell Japanese is a first language. And it's because, one, I lived in America for 6.5 years, and two, I've learned to change my behavior based on who I'm talking to. So what I do in speaking English, I don't do in Japanese, because if you consider the cultural nuances, they don't operate the same. For example, the same sentence can convey different stances in English versus in Japanese. Let's say in the business setting, you're talking to someone upon an agreement or something. In English, you might say, "We will consider this," where the main character in this sentence is you, the person making the final decision. But in Japanese, you might say, "ご検討させていただきます," which is the same exact meaning, but the "sasete itadakimasu" part of the sentence is a humble expression often used in Japan that implies, "We will take action with your permission." So based on the phrasing, the main character is not you, even though you're the person making the final decision. So each phrasing, same meaning, gives a different impression that fits each culture. But with countless of other examples like such, when it's ingrained into the language, it shapes the way that you think and see things that can have an effect to your behavior. So again, it's not that I'm being two different people. I'm just delivering the same message according to what's appropriate upon that language or culture I'm dealing with. So if I'm speaking to an American, I feel that I'm expected to deliver my opinion assertively to the other person because that's just how the culture is. And not to say you can't be assertive in Japanese, you absolutely can, but there is a Japanese way to do it, and the way that you would show confidence and assertiveness in American won't do it in the Japanese culture. Perhaps this was extremely long-winded for a simple question, but to answer how I'm switching two languages is I'm switching my behavior or persona in a sense. However, this is just my story and experience, and I don't think this is the case for all English and Japanese bilinguals. I have met some people who can equally sustain the same impression that is natural for both cultures. And what I find is that they have either attended an international school in Japan, or they have somehow fluently had both languages growing up, whether they are mixed with Japanese or have traveled often, or that they grew up in both cultures, both inside the house and outside the house, which I do feel is a different environment from how I grew up. That is all from me today. I definitely shared more than I intended, but do let me know if any part in particular was interesting, and hope you join me on my journey through my channel. Until next time.